All right, it's July 24th, 2018. We're on Like You Want to Drive, the home of Michael and Gina Wilmus, who've allowed us to use their home for this production, filming of this production. Start out by talking about some of our family members. My grandfather, Martin Hogh, was born in Denmark, March 30, 1856. His father's name was Soren Jepsen Hogh. His mother was Ann Olsen, O-H-L-S-E-N. I do have a picture of her. I have nothing of his father. He was born in a town called Stubbe, but moved to a town called Vela, or near a town called Vela, which is a pretty good-sized town, about 50,000 today. I don't know what it was then. He worked as an apprentice carpenter for either 2 or 3 years, was not paid, but he learned carpentry. He could do just about anything that a journeyman carpenter could do. He could build a house, he could, and he did build houses, barns, corn cribs, all kinds of farm buildings. He also could make furniture. He made a few pieces. We still have a few things that he made. And he was very good at it. Everything he had done was done by hand. There were no power tools in those days. And if there were, he probably wouldn't have been comfortable using them anyway. But at the age of 36, which is a somewhat advanced age for immigration, he decided to move his wife and his 4 children from Denmark to Sioux City, Iowa. He had a friend in Sioux City, Iowa, whose name was Knudsen. He apparently had emigrated from Denmark earlier and was settled in Sioux City. So they went to Copenhagen on May 29th of 1890, got on a ship, and sailed the North Sea to England. He spent his birthday on the North Sea. Got to England, landed on the coast of England, and took a train from there to, I've been told, Liverpool, but I don't have any written confirmation of that. In Liverpool, they boarded a ship for America. There was some problem with the ticket. He could have wound up in Canada, and with the language problem, it was a little bit difficult. But he found somebody on the ship who could speak English and Danish, and they got it straightened out. And they sailed to New York City. They came into New York. Ellis Island wasn't open yet, so they would have landed at Castle Garden in early June of 1890. And at that time, the only way of transportation inland in America was either a riverboat or a railroad. So he took a train to Sioux City. I've been told that when he got to Sioux City, he had a wife, 4 children, and 50 cents. But he did know Mr. Knudsen, who lived in Sioux City, who assisted him. He went to work immediately as a carpenter. He was a good carpenter, so he had no trouble finding work. In Sioux City, his one son, Valdemar, who was about 2 years old, died. There was also a daughter born after they got to America, who also died as a child. In the fall of 1893, what's described as my uncle described as the hard times of 93, his wife died. Apparently she'd had cancer. According to Uncle Sam, he believed that's what happened to her. She's buried, and the children are buried in Floyd Cemetery in Sioux City, which is a municipal cemetery. They were buried in unmarked graves. And unfortunately, there was some graft involved in the operation of that cemetery. So periodically, the people running it would destroy the records to hide their tracks. So there's no way to find their graves, but they're buried there. So for a while, he was a single parent. He used to tell of his daughter, Aunt Regina, playing. He'd take her to work with him, and she'd play in the shavings of things he was building. You know, being a carpenter, he used the plane a lot, and no power tools. Everything he did was by hand. There were no power tools then. And if there were, he probably wouldn't have been comfortable with them anyway. But he built houses and built farm buildings, barns, corn cribs, you name it. Built a few pieces of furniture. We still have a couple of things that he built. He built some picture frames. We have a few of those, and they were very well done. So he, as I say, was a single parent for about a year and a half, and then he met Grandma. Grandma was Karentine Moggensen. She had left Denmark, the island of Langland, which is in the southern part of Denmark. She and her sister immigrated about 1880, came to Sergeant Bluff, where there was a settlement of Danish people, and her fiancé was already there, Fred Christensen. So as soon as they arrived, as she arrived, they got married, and they lived near Sergeant Bluff. Unfortunately, in 1893, also 1893 in December, he died, and he's buried in the Sergeant Bluff Cemetery. He has a tombstone. So Grandma had two children, Uncle Nelson and Annie, no husband. She had a bachelor brother who came and did the farm work. She was living on a farm. So it wasn't long that she met Grandpa, and the two of them got married, probably as much of necessity as anything else, because it's very difficult for single parents in those days. So they got married, and they lived at Salix. They farmed at Salix for a few years, but then in 1903, there was a group of people came in from Illinois. They were of French descent. I think they were French-Canadian. I'm sure they were. They came in, and they were pretty well off financially, so they bought a lot of the land around Salix and rented a lot more. And those people who didn't own farms had no place to live, so they came to Dakota County in Nebraska, which is across the river. In spring of 1903, they packed up their belongings and loaded them in wagons and headed for Nebraska. They came to where the Floyd Monument was then and is now, and crossed the river on the ice because it was quicker that way than going through Sioux City and across the bridge. And with horses and wagons, time was of the essence. Now, Grandma and the small children came on the train. They didn't come in the wagons, but they brought wagons with livestock and possessions, and made the trip out to Goodwin, Nebraska, where Grandpa had rented a farm. He also owned some land south of there, and the plan was they would rent this farm for a while, and there were no buildings on the farm that he owned. So he rented a farm with had buildings in it, and then the plan was eventually build buildings on the land he owned and move out there. Well, 3 years later, this is in 1903, in 1906, the widow who owned the farm decided she wanted to sell it and offered it to him. And being right next to a town, close to a school, close to a store, post office, railroad station, stockyards, and the things that made life easier, it was a no-brainer. So he sold the land he had south of there and bought the farm in Summit Precinct in Dakota County. That was in 1906. He and Grandma had 3 children. Uncle Fred, born in 1897, Dad, born in 1898, and Aunt Martha, born in 1900, all at Salix. So they were all small children when they came to Dakota County. Uncle Fred had gone to school in Salix for a year or so, and he and Dad walked to school from home, which was a pretty good distance because the school was not where it later was. But then and they used to go over to Goodwin, and they'd wait for the teacher. The teacher lived in Goodwin, close to Goodwin, where Webbs live now. And she would come out with them, and then they'd walk down the track to the school, which was probably half a mile down the track. But then in 1905, a vote was held to move the schoolhouse to Goodwin. And it was decided to move the schoolhouse. So it was moved on horses and wagons to Goodwin, which was a lot closer to home, which was handy for them and for the people who lived in Goodwin. And they completed their schooling there. That was as far as they went. None of them went to high school in those days. At least none of our family went to high school. So they lived on the farm east of Goodwin until 1918, when Grandpa decided to sell and move to town. So he sold the farm for $200 an acre to a real estate company. This was right at the end of World War I, and things were pretty prosperous farm-wise because with the war going on in Europe, there wasn't much farming done in Europe. They couldn't do it because they were busy fighting, or the whole country had been turned into battlefields. France and Germany had been. So at the end of World War I, he sold the farm, $200 an acre, to a real estate company. The real estate company marked it up to $240, sold it to a man named Severance, and convinced Grandpa to carry a mortgage on it, which was unfortunate for him because all he got out of the farm was a down payment. The Severance family lived there. They couldn't pay it. Things got bad after the end of the war. There was a depression in the farm area, and they were unable to pay. So in 1923, Grandpa got the farm back. In the meantime, Dad and Uncle Fred lived on a farm that was east of where we live now, where Hans Larson lived, and then they lived for a while on the farm where Webbs live now. Not in that house. It was an older house that was there, and they lived there for a while and farmed there. And they bought a corn sheller and shelled a lot of corn. Life wasn't easy, for 2 bachelors, because in those days you had no frozen food, no microwaves, no nothing automatic. It was just a wood stove, so you had to cook on a wood stove, and you had to cook everything from scratch. But anyway, they lived there, and in 1923 they went back to Grandpa's farm. Grandpa had a house in town and had a mortgage on it when the Depression came, and his sons were not even aware that he had a mortgage on it. But when the Depression came, he couldn't meet the mortgage, so he had to leave that house, and he came back to the farm in Goodwin and lived there the rest of his days, and Grandma lived there the rest of her days also. They both died in the house. Dad and Uncle Fred were living there. Uncle Fred got married in 1930, and a year or two later he bought a farm north of Willis and moved over there. And then Dad stayed in the farm belonging to Grandpa. In 1936, he got married. Gertrude and Shirley were both born in the house where we live now. When Gertrude was born, they lived there. When Shirley was born, they were living over by Willis, but it was a very difficult winter, and that was rather remote, but at least where we lived was next door to a town. So Aunt Mary came over there and stayed there till the baby was delivered, and I don't know how long afterwards. But she was born March 25th, 1936. 1936 was a very difficult year. Not only was the Depression going on, but a very severe drought hit Nebraska and most of the Midwest. And there were no crops raised, or very few. Well, actually, there weren't any. It rained in April, then it rained again in September, and nothing in between. So whatever was planted, for the most part, didn't germinate. Dad had a little bit of corn because the field next to the creek, which was moist because it was so close to the creek. So he raised a little bit of corn. Most people didn't even pick their corn. They'd just turn the cattle into it and let them eat it because there was nothing there to pick. There were no ears. So, and I don't remember them telling in 1936, 4th of July, they went down to Crystal Lake, which is approximately where we are now, which at that time was a resort, an amusement park. And they were down there, it was 114 degrees on the 4th of July. And of course, that was the day that pretty much finished up what little crops there were, because it destroyed them. Some people used to talk about the morning of July 4th, the corn looked pretty good. But by the afternoon, with that kind of temperature, it was shot. So after that, they went back to their farms and did the best they could. The crops were very sparse, and even what little bit was produced wasn't worth anything. Of course, in those days, you had to feed the horses. The farm machinery was powered by horses, not by tractors, and you had to feed the horses, whether they were working or not. A lot of farms raised a lot of oats and went mostly to feed the horses, and there was pasture, but with no rain, the pastures all dried up, so things got pretty bad. But as time went by, things got a little bit better. And then, of course, World War II came along, and farm prices improved tremendously because there were shortages of food, shortages of everything. I know it was, when we'd go to town, you'd have to take ration books and tokens. Tokens were blue or red, little pieces of cardboard, looked about not as big as a penny, probably about the size of a dime. And to buy most things, you needed tokens or stamps. To buy shoes, you needed stamps. To buy gasoline, you needed stamps. To buy sugar, you needed stamps. To buy meat, you needed stamps. So it was, but prices were better because it was of the war. The problem then was trying to get people to do the farm work because farms weren't very well mechanized in those days. It was still the horse machinery. But people survived. It would take a lot of people. I remember when the year Grandma died in 1942, we had 4 or 5 men living there picking corn because a man who was good at it, young and strong and good at it, could pick 100 bushels in a day, 50 in the morning, 50 in the afternoon. But that didn't go very far with a big field of corn. So it took a lot of labor to do that. And the same way with the harvesting of the oats. The oats would be cut with a binder into bundles, and then the bundles would be put into what was called shocks, little stacks. And then after a period of time, there'd be a thrashing crew come with a machine, and they'd go out with hay racks and load up the bundles and bring them in and throw them into the thrashing machine, which would separate the oats from the straw. And the oats you'd put in a bin, the straw would be put in a pile, and later on people could use it to haul it into the barns and use it for bedding of their horses and their cattle. And of course the horses had to be taken care of every day. So that, I think, brings us up to date with the Hogh family up to the World War II anyway.